Welcome to CCTV America's week-long coverage of the IMF World Bank spring meetings. All this week, we will be bringing you the news and the newsmakers from the gathering taking place right here in Washington, D.C. So the question is, what are these spring meetings about? We will explain. Every year at this time, thousands of government officials from around the world, journalists, NGOs, and other invited participants gather here in Washington, D.C. They will discuss the progress on the IMF and World Bank's economic and financial projects around the world. Then there are, of course, the seminars, and lots of them, and briefings, and many other events focused on the global economy. And the international development programs and the global financial markets will also be on the agenda. The participants will have plenty to chew on over the week. Here are some of the issues facing the global economy. In the U.S., the Fed's taper in its stimulus spending is one of the biggest factors. Fed Chair Janet Yellen says the pace of the taper depends on unemployment, and Friday's monthly jobs number, well, disappointed the markets. Meanwhile, the world's #2 economy, China, is trying to keep up with its economic growth. They just introduced new stimulus measures aimed at meeting the government's growth targets. Then there's the 1-2 punch of China's slowing growth and the Fed's stimulus drawdown. That is a major challenge to emerging markets such as Brazil, India, and Turkey. The IMF has said that emerging economies will grow this year, but just not quite as fast as before. The countries with more trade with China could struggle. Meanwhile, Europe continues its baby steps forward. Germany is a little better, while Portugal is getting ready to emerge from its international bailout program. But unemployment remains a major problem, especially among the young. And then there's Crimea. The geopolitical standoff involving Russia, Ukraine, and the West has sent shivers down the spine of global investors, and Russia could be headed towards a recession. And no one's quite sure right now how that crisis will ultimately be resolved. China and Russia and other major developing nations are angry about a delay in Washington that has blocked a reform plan that would give them a bigger vote and a bigger voting share at the IMF. Now, the countries are pushing forward with reforms without waiting for the U.S. Shraysi Tandon is our go-to correspondent this week, and she now joins us live from the CCTV newsroom. Trace?
Hi, Phil. That's right. Most of the IMF's 188 member nations have actually approved the reforms which were hammered out back in 2010. Now, they have been waiting patiently for the U.S. to act before proceeding with talks on a second round of voting changes to further increase the power of these emerging economies. But opposition by U.S. lawmakers is really testing the patience of these major developing nations, Phil. Countries like Brazil, Russia, China have all urged U.S. Congress to cooperate. And now the United Kingdom is the latest country to urge the U.S. to stop the delay. Britain is urging the U.S. Congress to approve reforms at the International Monetary Fund that would give more power to emerging economies at the institution. In a recent public address, British Finance Minister George Osborne said, quote, "The failure of the U.S. Congress to ratify the agreed IMF reforms is bad for the institution and bad for the international community. I urge the administration and Congress to act to pass them now." Most of the IMF's 188 member nations have approved the reforms, which were originally hammered out back in 2010. But opposition from the House and Senate Republicans have blocked efforts by the White House to pass the reform. Experts say it's crucial for developing nations to have a seat at the table.
The main rules of the game internationally on how countries are supposed to deal with their currencies, on reserves, on sort of the big questions in international finance are really negotiated out at the IMF. So for these countries who had not had much of a voice in the kind of international rules of the game when they were substantially smaller and poorer than they are now that they've grown so rapidly and their economies are so large, they want a seat at the table. They want to be able to participate in shaping the rules that they will partially have to live by.
If the U.S. Congress gives the reforms a green light, it would make China the IMF's third largest member. It would also revamp the IMF board, reducing the dominance of Western European nations. U.S. lawmakers are concerned about relinquishing power to some emerging economies.
First, Congress is traditionally fairly skeptical about international institutions, and that's been true since the founding of the international system. Second, there's a lot of skepticism about China's intentions on issues like currency reform. And third, now, unfortunately, there's a lot of concern about Russia And because this package was negotiated in a context where sort of all the emerging powers see their shares rise, there's now a new preoccupation about seeing Russia's share rise, even though Russia's share will rise by a tiny fraction.
For many, the political fight remains quite puzzling because the drive to place these reforms at the IMF was actually initiated during George W. Bush's administration, has been backed by leaders in both the Bush and Reagan administration. Now, we all need to remember that 5 years ago when this reform was introduced, there were actually 12 Republicans that supported President Barack Obama. However, those Republicans are now no longer in Congress. So, Phil, with continuous calls to action by U.S. leaders as well as governments from all over the world, a lot of foreign policy experts I spoke to today say they're quite optimistic that this reform will eventually pass because you just can't deny the importance of these developing economies. Phil?
All right, Trace, we look forward to your coverage all this week. Thank you very much, live from the newsroom.